Um, that's a useful announcement. And at the end of day one, as is the tradition, we're usually inviting someone to give a keynote speech. And this year we did, because the organizing committee of this colloquium involved quite a few of different research committees. We were looking to accommodate two different strands of research. One is focused on institutional accommodation of minorities in diverse places, such as this one, given the title of our colloquium, which is Challenges of Plural Societies. At the same time, the second challenge was someone who does appreciate the complexity of this regional ethno-political dynamics that we have witnessed in, well, in the broader post-socialist space. And in conversation with colleagues from other research committees, the name of Zsuzsa Csergő was dropped out several times, so we were also quite lucky to have Zsuzsa agreeing to come over here from far away Vienna this time around. The topic that Zsuzsa agreed or suggested to speak to also, I think, fits the aspiration that we signposted in the conference theme of challenges of plural society. In the majority of cases across post-socialist Europe, as you would know as specialists, it is particularly the claims that minority communities field on the states of residence that are perceived to challenge the security of that state. Whether they do so in reality or these are believed to challenge the democratic processes and democratic institutions of the state is a different matter altogether. And so observing Zsuzsa's work over the past several decades, starting with the Talk of the Nation, where the focus on language, linguistic accommodation of Hungarian-speaking communities in Slovakia and Romania was the focus, and throughout her work that looked at kin minorities in countries of Central Eastern Europe, I thought that particularly the project, which I believe to be the book in printing, would give us a good idea of where the trajectory of looking at minority contestations across Eastern Europe can lead us from the ground up perspective. A lot of knowledge of case-specific minority situations that comes from Zsuzsa, but also an important appreciation of those challenges that many of these now EU member states have had to mount and mountains to climb ahead of the accession and later as member states of European Union. We hope to hear a little bit more from Professor Zsuzsa Csergő at Queen's University in Kingston, not my Queen's. But importantly, also in reflection of year-long work that Zsuzsa has been doing as a president of Association for the Study of Nationalities, the organization that brings scholars doing a lot of interesting ground-up work, ethnographic, anthropological, sociological, political science work in and across Eastern Europe. So that administrative duty, I suspect, is over. But that gives you, Zsuzsa, I think, an interesting vantage point to consider what is the state of research and what is the state of contestations that we might hear from minorities that are either resilient or not. Well, I'll leave it to you to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, can you hear me if I just stand and walk around a bit? Okay. Thank you so much, Timofey, for that, for the invitation and for that really generous introduction. It's a privilege to be here. And thank you for coming in. Timofey did not specifically ask me to be provocative. I just did that on my own to title this keynote talk, Resilient Minorities, at a time when we live in a majoritarian moment. And, as I sometimes tell myself and others, we do things in this profession, not because they're easy, but because we think they're important. in addressing big questions, and especially sensitive questions. And so let me tell you what I mean by this, and I'm going to talk essentially about the book I'm writing based on research I have been doing on my own and also collaboratively with lots of help, including help from colleagues, some of whom are sitting in this room, and with whom we came up with some of the concepts I'm using collaboratively, with whom we are also working on a big project collaboratively, and hopefully continuing to do that. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about the framing of that, and then invite your input. So, why we need resilient minorities? And I'm going to start by putting out a quote here, which goes like this: democracy is not a state, it is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we called the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. I wonder whether some of you recognize the author of this. Just a little bit of suspense. It's John Lewis, the American civil rights icon, who wrote this in summer 2020. I'm going to pause here a little bit to invite you to think back to the world in summer 2020. John Lewis was a really, really significant actor in the American civil rights movement. He died in July 2020, about mid-July. And the New York Times published this piece by him posthumously at the end of July 30th, I believe, 2020. And the title was Together You Can Redeem the Soul of Our Nation. It's a very positive, obviously very optimistic outlook. And if you think about what was going on in the US, for example, what was happening there, it was in May 2020 that George Floyd was murdered by a white policeman in Minneapolis. Summer 2020 was also the time of the presidential campaign peaking with lots of, the camp that was supporting the re-election of then President Donald Trump was lining up behind some hateful, divisive rhetoric. And, but it was also a time when the Black Lives Matter movement gained so much support in American society that in summer, I think it was toward the end of 2020 when the survey was done, that showed that about 67% of American adults supported the Black Lives Matter movement, which is very high, because this includes a sample of all American adults. And so we also have to know that by 2023, this went down to 51%. And among African Americans and Hispanic Americans, it still remained quite high. But the average was only 51% within just 3 years, which tells us something about the turn of events that were mentioned by many of you in your presentations about this turn to authoritarianism, support for autocratic, polarizing, divisive rulers. And so when John Lewis wrote this essay that came out in the New York Times, he still believed in the resilience of American society. He had reasons to believe in the resilience of American society against what he saw as efforts to deepen racial and ideological divisions, to turn social segments against each other by reinforcing fears, in essence, undoing a lot of the hard work that had been done by civil rights activists, of which he had been part. And against the essentially evisceration of the pluralist ethos. And so among the great challenges of plural societies ever, always, but especially today, when there is a lot of fear, justifiable fear, and there is a majoritarian impulse, is the constant work that is necessary to create and maintain the kind of social resilience that is democratic resilience, that is solidarity and mutual respect and empathy and all that. So it's not the kind of resilience that can also happen, by the way, of course, when, and there's literature on this, I'm sure many of you are well versed in that literature that shows that civil society organizations can also line up behind autocrats and dividers and haters. And there's a lot of literature on what happened in Weimar Germany, for example. And so the kind of resilience I am talking about is the democratic resilience that is the pluralist resilience. And so why we need resilient minorities is because we need resilient societies, and resilient minorities, democratically resilient minorities are necessary for resilient societies. And that's why I'm not afraid to use the term. And one reason why I was showing you the quote by John Lewis is that he emphasized democracy as an act, not as a state, not as something that, you know, we create, we establish institutions, and then we sit back and say, okay, we were right, we are done. No, it's work in progress, and it's lots of work. And because there is forgetting, there's misremembering, there's misuse of collective memory and all that. And so it's constant work. And so it requires political agency. And so what do we mean by political agency? There's lots of literature on this as well. There's a rich literature in political theory on political agency. And there's recognition that it's at the core, agencies at the core of democracy as an act. It's the key to individuals' authority over their lives, to decide about one's condition in life, about the rules by which we are expected to live, and how we practice them. And I'm putting up here another quote by a political theorist, Margaret Moore, whom whose work many of you may know already. She wrote this very important, impactful book on political theory of territory that came out from Oxford in 2015, in which she says it is morally important. Not surprising, she is a theorist who comes from the justice perspective, both important to individuals and morally valuable in an objective sense that individuals have control over the collective conditions of their lives, and control in the relationships that give meaning to their lives, including their relationships with each other and with place. And because I live in Canada, where indigeneity is very strongly present, finally, in public discourse, also in the way we talk and think about these relationships. One of the additions that I'm hoping is going to happen, and I'm introducing it in my book a little bit, but only in the theoretical part because I haven't actually done research on it, is to add the ecological dimension to this. So it's because the individual and collective dimensions of political agency are recognized, but the ecological dimension is not yet there. And human beings are individual and social beings, and we are embedded in ecosystems with obligations toward our environment, the animal world, nature, and also the material world, which might sound like I'm adding it just to cover everything, but when we think of the destruction that war is doing in Ukraine or elsewhere, we have obligations for the material world as well as part of what we do as ACT. And so I'd like to highlight that and invite you to think about that. The next thing I'm going to highlight is the recursive relationship, mutual construction among these elements of agency, institutions, and resilience, democratic resilience. And again, this is something that, especially between agency and structures, the so-called structure agency debate has been there forever. I'm a political scientist, a comparative political scientist. This is one of the things. If you teach 3 big themes, this is one of them. And so there is a debate, and I stand with those proudly, with those who say there's no linear causality, but there is a recursive mutual construction. There's a relationship in which little segments can be studied and operationalized as causality. And we know that institutions can have significant impact on agency, but then agents live in institutions, act in them, create them. Institutions are not just buildings. We know all of this. And yet we sometimes forget it when we think about how this actually needs to work in the context of resilience. So these are always in interplay in a relationship of mutual constitution, and I'm complicating it by adding social resilience. But still, there are things we can operationalize. We can operationalize institutions as rules, as organizations. We can operationalize and study agency as an attribute of actors, individuals, and groups. And when it comes to democratic resilience, something that has been emphasized in the literature is the significance of the meso level of institutions, the so-called intermediary institutions. And to use Guillermo O'Donnell's term for this, when we think of the sustainability of democracy, the work that it takes for every generation, that's where alternative power can reside to withstand, resist authoritarians, nationalizers who might be exclusivist nationalizers. And also, it provides resilience. Institutions provide resilience also in the sense of providing time horizon to people. This is, again, something that O'Donnell emphasized, that it's very, very significant for people to have a time horizon. You send your kid to a school today, you want to know that the school is going to exist in 5 years. You put in a lot of work to create a literary club or a social club or a small theater or whatever. You want to know that that's going to exist in a few years from now. So they provide time horizon, they provide some kind of predictability. And they also then, once they become routinized, they can be challenged, they can be, there can be dissent within those institutions as well. So the meso level is very significant, and institutions at the meso level are providing a lot of the resilience also for minority actors who do not own the state. And I'm putting up here a figure, an image that we created together with Olga Talal and Tomasz Kisz for when we were visualizing these relationships, the institutional path toward democratic agency. It essentially is a simplified way of saying that for people to gain agency, first they have to have access to institutions. And of course, we could spend a lot of time unpacking how that comes to be. But you need access to institutions, then you have to participate. Without that, there's no agency. So this is a required path to agency. So for those of us who are thinking in terms of what it takes for democratic agency to happen, this is not a bad way to think about it. Now, what happens when people are under persistent structural disadvantage? These are persistent minorities I'm talking about. Ethnic minorities, linguistic minorities, religious minorities, racial minorities, cultural minorities, essentially, are in focus. In order to discuss this and do research on it, we have to understand what I call the minority condition, which is a local manifestation of a global structural logic. It's the outcome of the nation state model. It's not something that one state or another does because it's populated by titulars in the state center that hate minorities. It's the logic of the nation state to create comfortable majorities, because a comfortable majority is easier to rule. And the state is easier to maintain. That's the logic of the nation state. And so if you have a structural logic like that, it creates a sense of titularity. And the sense of titularity is a condition that makes people who belong to the core culture, to the mainstream culture, to experience their culture as the natural order of things, and seeing the minority cultures as extraordinary, as outliers in their state. So the titularity means that majority members are likely to see the state from a perspective of entitlement, as normal, and minority culture reproduction and what it takes, interest representation, institutions, anything that makes minority culture sustainable, to see that as special, something that needs justification, something that is costly. It requires extra motivation, it requires extra work, it requires extra resources, and it needs to be constantly justified. And for this reason, it's a structural thing that minorities tend to see the state from a different angle. That's the minority condition, the persistent minority condition. And we actually know, we have insufficient knowledge about it, about what that means. Even though there's a rich literature on minority politics, laws, there's a rich literature on the management of ethnically plural societies. There's actually not enough knowledge about the minority perspective and what it means for democratic resilience and what it takes for minority actors to become democratically resilient actors, part of a resilient society. And so I am putting these up there as the three major characteristics that are global about the minority condition, in the sense that minorities living in majoritarian states everywhere encounter these. One of them is scarcity, because the minority condition starts with numbers. It's a persistent weakness, relative weakness in numbers. They don't own the state, as Andreas Wimmer has emphasized in a piece he published also in 2020, as it turns out. And so we can talk about this later if you're interested, but this is why it's not coincidental that ethnic demography is so important for minorities and also for majorities, of course, because this is about the project of creating a comfortable majority while at the same time having minorities within the state. The other one is uncertainty. So even if some states do create what Abdizadeh calls counter-majoritarian institutions that are constitutionally entrenched, such as various types of autonomies, which guarantee minority institutions, even though there's a cluster of majoritarian states that do that, most states do not. And in those states, minority rights and institutions are always continuously up for grabs. There are always matters of political contestation, with minority actors constantly having to say, we are still here, we are large enough to be worthy of support, but not too large. Don't be afraid of us, and let's talk. And so uncertainty is a built-in condition, built-in part of the minority condition. And it makes ethnopolitics an entrenched and routinized feature of political contestation in majoritarian states. And then there is the built-in securitization aspect, which I don't have to belabor for you because you are aware of the securitization. It becomes especially acute when the minority has a kin state in the neighborhood. But the built-in securitization aspect is always there. It's on a spectrum. It can be a problem if a minority is too organized, too large. It can be a problem if a minority is, for some reason, perceived by the titular actors as a source of security or destabilizing component for the state. So these three are constantly there as features of the minority condition, but then it's also situational, local, and I'm showing you this four-dimensional thing along which the way each minority population is situated might be comparatively analyzed. And again, this is another simplification, but this is also a set of structural conditions, but it's a set of local structural conditions. So obviously numbers, relative numbers, as well as absolute numbers. Absolute numbers matter a great deal. If a minority is more populous, they can maintain to stay more of a diversity of institutions across societal domains that can also allow for dissent and pluralism within the minority. Places, ethnic demography in places, life takes place, especially the social life of the individual takes place where they live. And so it matters where they are, and numbers in places, and whether those places are rural or urban, whether they are close to a kin-state border, whether they are close to the state capital. These are all significant features. Time, historicity. Minorities that have been there for a longer time have a higher chance to be recognized by the titular group than those who have come in more recently. Also, there is an institutional tradition, there is learning. So it wasn't coincidental that minorities that were traditional historic minorities, homeland minorities, for example, in this region after 1990, were readier to form political parties. Poles in Lithuania were among the first who created a party because they knew exactly what they wanted, those 2-3 things. Hungarians in Romania and Slovakia as well. Russian speakers in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia took longer. So it's also time in terms of learning to be a minority. So continuing minorities were better positioned to organize themselves. And then there's status, which is the relative socioeconomic status. I don't have to belabor that. One thing that we noticed in the research that we have done so far is that the longer a population is in political minority condition, the wider the gap, the ethnic gap becomes in majoritarian states. It would be important, and I hope that at some point we can do a comparative on this, but it's something to watch. Okay, so once we have an understanding of what the minority condition is, and if you accept this, that agency is necessary for social resilience, then we have to ask, so how is minority democratic agency different from democratic agency, political agency generally? So what's special about this? And here I'm going to give you another 3 components, characteristics. One of them is limited. It's always limited. The other one is that it's always extra work in the majoritarian state. And it also requires extra motivation. So it's more costly. It's just simply more costly under the condition of scarcity, uncertainty, and built-in securitization. And so what is the institutional path to minority democratic agency? And as I mentioned earlier, I take this loop-like concept of the relationship between agency and institutions. So it's built through the interplay of minority actors whom I describe as constant balancers in multiple relational fields. I'm going to show you what I mean in a second. And what I call minority institutional capital, which is a network of organizations across multiple societal domains. And again, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I mean by that, because as we know, again, institutions can also work against democratic resilience. So first, minority actors balancing, working, fighting, controlling each other, and trying to work to strategize in multiple relational fields. One of them is the intra-minority field, in which there's work for coherence, for representation, for trying to maintain interest among minority members. The challenge there is intra-minority pluralism versus control and intra-minority autocracy, which is something that also came up today in one of the talks. There's the titular minority field, which is, of course, extremely significant for minorities because they live in states in which they don't own the state. They are in persistent minority status. And so they have to work for minority-friendly allies. They have to bargain for support. The challenge there is that there's this constant ethnopolitics. And so they have to compromise without losing intra-minority support. All of this, keep in mind, in the condition of smaller pool of people who are wearing different hats and uncertainty and securitization. And then there's the interminority field, which has not been studied very much in Central and Eastern Europe, except for Lithuania, where there is relatively good research on Polish, Russian interminority collaboration in the political field, but there is a rich literature on this about racial and racialized minorities in the US. So there are good reasons to tap into that. Also for expanding the scope of our understanding of the minority condition and what it means to be working in different fields, for example, with Roma minorities, also between longer settled and newer communities and such. So this is a somewhat unexplored, understudied field in our region, where, of course, there are all kinds of challenges that the literature on racial minorities in the US points out. One of them is simply to harmonize diverse interests so that you can create a more minority-friendly environment or push for minority-friendly policy in the state center, while at the same time keeping your own folk interested in voting for you and supporting you. So agency can be lost in each of these relational fields. But what I'm telling you is that it can only be built effectively if it's built in all these fields well. So the fourth one is the cross-border field, working for external reinforcement. And of course, the challenge there is preventing the increase of securitization. And also, I didn't put this up there, but obviously preventing dependence from an external government. And I can't think of any right now, but but there's that. So the cross-border field. So each of these relational fields, and I'm taking obviously the concept from Brubaker and Bourdieu and others who are thinking in terms of relational fields. So each of these is a minefield, and each of these needs to be balanced and navigated through work. And it's done in a world in which you have limited agency. And it's under the minority condition. So who are these actors? And I'm using in the book two shorthands, one for political actors and one for intermediary actors. For the clusters of actors who are doing this, the political actors are the best known in the literature because that's what's usually studied because it's easier. They are more visible. They are the ones who are visibly directly political. His job is to perform that job, to be in that capacity. They're elected. There is emerging literature on non-elected actors, bureaucrats. And the other cluster is what I call intermediary actors. If you can suggest a better word, I'm very happy to consider anything else, because political actors are also intermediary, a lot of them. So I know it's not a very good concept for the cluster, but I'm thinking the intermediary institutions and intermediary actors, but there might be a better aggregate term for this, but essentially it's a shorthand for those who work less visibly in these institutions, so associational, the associational organizational world. And the main challenge, I think, school directors, teachers, journalists, media directors, priests, and so on. And so the main challenge there is for these people to make minority life appealing and sustainable despite the limitations of the minority condition. In a variety of local settings where numbers might be decreasing and there's aging and there's a lot going on. And then there's the other component, the institutional component. I call minority institutional capital. And again, think conditions of scarcity, uncertainty, built-in securitization. So what kind of institutional sphere creates democratic resilience? Again, not many things, just 4 conditions. One of them is that it has to be made up of a dense and diverse network of organizations in multiple domains, because minority people are also people who want access to all kinds of institutions. And so not all of these have to be separate institutions, but people like to have access to various cultural, associational events and possibilities. And so it's made up of a dense and diverse network of organizations in multiple domains. And here, I'm not listing only the so-called nonprofit, non-governmental organizations, because that's a very, it's a large sphere of the minority associational world, but we want to see the whole picture that also includes the political, and those that are local governments, for example, are very, very important, where minorities live in higher numbers. It has to enable minority agency decision-making, at least within the organization. And it needs to create both this institutional sphere, both intra-ethnic bonding, because without that, cultures don't exist, and inter-ethnic bridging, because without that, minorities become segregated, they can become ignored, marginalized, they can be alienated, not good for democratic resilience and solidarity and all that. And it has to be maintained through reliable and renewable resources for sustainability. Again, I put there without political strings attached, because I have in mind minorities that are getting a lot of external support with political strings attached. And that's not going to necessarily be good at all for democratic resilience. So it's a tall order. Again, requiring extra work from minority actors, working in multiple relational fields simultaneously, minority institutional capital that provides resources, time horizon, bonding as well as bridging. Does it sound utopian to you a little bit? Nonetheless, in most cases, ordinary minority people pursue these things. And so even though a lot of the literature on state-minority relations focuses on violence and violent conflict, around the world, people living in the minority condition, are whom I call ordinary minorities, are living in this kind of condition and are pursuing a good life in various ways, through the pursuit of political agency, through associations, organized ways, in institutionalized ways. And so the loop, again, is, people have asked me, so, okay, so where do you start? What causes what? It's a loop. So strength in institutional capital interplays with strength in the kind of agency that can make people invested in democratic forms of agency. So if it sounds tautological, it is what I'm saying. And that's how it generates resilience. And I'm going to put that up there, that we don't know enough about this. There's an urgent need for more research, for more knowledge about what makes people living in a persistent minority condition interested, capable, interested in working toward democratic resilience. as opposed to alternatives. Ah, I need to turn this off in order for that. How do I, where's the switch? This?
So thank you. Zsuzsa, I had to think through and do some reference checks as well while you were talking. There is a lot to start from, and I think the structure agency debate underpins all of this framework that you provide for us to reflect upon. I'm sure that different types of scholars that we have assembled across the room, from legal scholars of minority issues to sociological studies of your colleagues from renowned Transylvanian institutions, all have their own take and translation of this framework into practice. My maybe opening question would be, how does this build upon the challenges that we have? So the framework of democratic resilience that you attribute to or call minorities to assume, I guess, more wholeheartedly, uses the term resilience in the first instance. And in that context, it is hard to evade this impression that resilience is something has been used in the discourse to justify the neoliberal atomization of people. So it seems that you do invest in, do an investment into more of a structural approach to this rather than atomized individual agency approach. So when you think of this, how specifically, which specific example would you give us that would say, well, this is the case of democratic resilience from the past that we have witnessed so far? Maybe that would make it easier also for us to kick off the conversation with country minority group specialists.
Okay. So
we want our online.
oh, okay. I wasn't aware of the neoliberal atomizing use of resilience, by the way. I'm interested in that, but generally, when it comes to this, to the use of concepts, I've given up on trying to find one that pleases everyone. So I've decided, I'm not sure that I would title the book Resilient Minorities, but I might. But I've decided to just explain the concept and then ask people who are listening or reading to come with me. And once they take that, if they don't like it, they can just close it and move away. But if they take that, then I can go from there, because it also starts with questions about, okay, who's a minority, and then you can write a whole chapter on that. So resilience, democratic resilience, the way I use it is a social thing that's not individual. Of course, there are other forms, not institutionalized forms of resilience, like protests, demonstrations. And I actually started with the civil rights movement, but the reason why, and there is a really, really good literature on minority politics in terms of movements, social movements, and it's very valuable. But movements, protests, events do not provide what organizations, institutions do, which is the sustainability aspect of it. The sustainability, the time horizon, and also the banks within which there can be developing, fighting over. Everyone does that. It's just that titular groups in a state, they also fight over what kinds of theater, what kinds of schools, what kinds of whatever. but they don't have to keep saying that we need schools, because they are going to use schools in their language and according to their cultural code. So the difference in the minority condition is that unless it's constitutionally entrenched, and even then it might be changeable, but unless it's constitutionally entrenched, it has to be constantly argued for, the worthiness of it, the existence of institutions themselves, and then within that, there's inter-minority debate of what kinds, how many, is it good enough, can we, challenge this, or is that going to be bad for us collectively? So in that sense, resilience is about this social aspect of it, and the organized, institutionalized way of dealing with conflict. Because that's what we are talking about, dealing with conflict. Conflict is normal. It would be terrible to live in a world in which we all think the same and act the same. But the question is how we deal with conflict, and and if it can be dealt with in rule-based, rule-governed ways, and those rules can be challenged, they can be changed, all of that. But the institutions, well, institutions in a broad sense are rules, right? So it's about also sustainability and predictability, and I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the sustainability of democracy in plural societies. I guess that's where I'm coming from. Now, for an example, for resilient minority, I would say Hungarians in Romania for 2012. I don't know whether my esteemed Transylvanian colleagues agree with me, but I would go out and fight for this claim that that's an example for a resilient, democratically resilient minority until 2012. And then since then, I think, remember the 4 fields? The cross-border field, they gave in to king state pressure that has not been helpful for their democratic resilience. They haven't done enough in the inter-minority field either, because it's a very large, relatively well-organized minority, so they haven't done enough in the inter-minority field with especially Roma, but also maybe other possible, anyway, but I would say that's an example. Why? Because if I can bring back what it takes, okay, so they were doing pretty well in the inter-minority field, holding it together, although of course there were tensions. But there's a 5% threshold in the Romanian parliament. And so what do you do if you are a 6-ish% minority? How do you get a seat? And they learn that it's actually helpful to have a seat, even more helpful to be in government, in the coalition government, because at least you're there. You can bargain better. Okay. Titular minority field, this is what I was talking about. Inter-minority field, I mentioned that they didn't do very well in that one, but and the cross-border field before 2012, I think they bargained. They did a pretty good work there before 2012. The other is the institutional capital, dense and diverse network of organizations, minority agency. I'm going to actually show you something about this. We have this comparative minority institutions database created with this guy and Olga Talal. We are hoping to continue and expand with your help, collaborative. But here, see associational density. Hungarians in Slovakia, Hungarians in Romania, high density. This is a simple measure. It's very raw to incomplete data, but it's essentially the number of organizations per 1,000 people, minority members. Quite interesting. structures of self-governance. We looked at minority governed. So these are organizations we're talking about. Minority governed, where the minority language and is the default. There's shared, which means that in these cases are usually run primarily by titular actors, but there is some minority stream. Think radio, for example, that has a programming stream in the minority language, or a school that has a university that has departments. So that's shared. There is multi-ethnic, where the goal, the mission is to try, at least within the organization, not to replicate outside hierarchies. Look at the numbers, the percentage of those, not very many. And then the majority governed, that's the mainstream, which we haven't actually surveyed. But we put it up there because we think it's important. So these are completely majority governed and in the majority code, running according to that, but they have significant minority presence in them. And so these are categories: organizational form. This is about funding, the resources, whether they are reliable, renewable. Again, a lot to unpack, but this tells us a little bit about where the funding comes from. So when I said that there are some measurable, operationalizable aspects of this is what I meant. These are large categories, but at least they're useful comparatively. And then we're hoping, and this is actually publicly accessible, what we have so far. We are hoping that they're going to raise questions, and then people can look into that. And they can email us and say, hey, we don't think that's right. or you should look also into this, or because, yeah.
I think this gives us a better understanding maybe of what specifically you mean when you speak about different aspects of minority agency and reflecting on how the accommodation strategies or resilience, democratic resilience can be read off the life of associational life of minorities across the board of states, but also in relation to state institutions' engagement with minorities. This would be, I think, the opportune moment for us to turn to our audience and see which challenges, questions do you see in the framework that we have here. Obviously, the majority complaints would be probably coming from European minority advocates, institutions that work with them. Let me see the show of hands first. So, okay. Unavoidably advocate. I think Europeans and for minorities here.
And I wanted to say that I have not put a fellow, but I also got support in here.
Yes, I am. I'm all okay. There we go. So one question and one statement. The statement is, thank you for this kind of not just very comprehensive and integrated presentation, but really a kind of research agenda, which I see in the fact that you had those four conditions or dimensions of the minority condition, the size and everything else. And if you can develop cases of across those dimensions, and then also look at the degree of minority agency for those different parameters, for those scope conditions, then you've got this kind of nice matrix of different minorities that represent different constellations of these structural factors, and how do those structural factors actually contribute or complicate their ability to create the democratic agency that you have. So that's one thing that's really, really exciting. The question that I have is all of this, the typical phrase, all of this is very nice, but how much do you see the achievement of that democratic agency actually changing the views and the prospects within the majority, because it takes two to tango, and therefore the minority could be perfectly formed with all of its democratic agency, and the majority just doesn't want to listen to it and doesn't want to, perhaps if I now make it into a more conceptual statement, that it doesn't want to help. The majority doesn't want to help to reduce the problems of the minority condition that you spoke about, namely the scarcity and the insecurity and everything. So do you see that that's the big sort of causal question, is how much does the democratic agency and the achievement of a democratic agency by the minority actually help their condition in the end? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
We'll pass on to the second, and we'll maybe collect a few more, Zsuzsa, so you can take a seat and.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Well, I have to come back to Timothy's comment about your term which you use, the resilience. So I'm not sure if I can agree with you with choosing this term. Even now, you give the example about these specific countries, but resilience itself, it's a concept that there is something pre-existing and resurrecting, making America great again. So making democracy great again. It's resilience. So maybe to generalize your idea, you have to choose another term. It's not specifically resilience. You need to choose some. I'm just thinking, for example, there's an old Romanian term which is interpolare. Interpolare. It's okay. It's Latin term. Interpolare, which is when you bring something old and you give it another perspective, or you give it another new dotation. Okay, so it is not making America great again or making democracy great again. So the resilience is something which is mostly related to liberalism, as Timothy said. So I need that you think about the concept. Okay, thank you.
I just have a brief question. I really like the categorization of the 4 different levels that minorities need to sort of negotiate. But it seems that the focus here is really on the sort of like minorities, but an ethno-national aspect. But I'm curious the extent to which you think your categorizations apply to cases of like sexual minorities, or even minorities like Roma, where there isn't that sort of like the last aspect that you have of like the sort of relationship with the kin state. Just kind of curious how these dynamics change and the extent to which your categorization might apply to cases of non-ethno-national minorities.
We'll do one more. I think the good news, Zsuzsa, is that you have only male questionnaires here.
Thank you. Just one comment. In tabulare, the term is illegal. It comes from the property law. It means some property law. It means, in fact, to introduce in a specific register of the state. But my question is a bit different. A good scientist makes predictions, more or less, yes? How do you see the minorities on 2060, for example, in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you. Any more volunteers for questions? Csergő, I can see hesitation. Atsuko will break up the male dominance.
Thank you. This was a really fascinating conceptual thing, but I just got stuck with this idea that the minority democratic agency is a tall order. And you said it's limited agency, lots of work. How on earth would anybody want to do that?
Csergő.
Yeah, thank you, Zsuzsa, for the presentation. I also like that, the conditions, the 4 categories or conditions that really resilient minorities have to fulfill. And I was wondering, I mean, looking at the examples you gave, it seems to me that they're all like large, politically engaged and minorities, in some cases, territorial concentrated minorities. And so it makes me wonder, what about like small minorities and territorial dispersed minorities? There's no chance that these minorities are resilient, or I mean, how they fit into this scheme. of your theoretical framework. Thank you.
I've seen one more hand somewhere. Is that? Okay. Zsuzsa, I think that will be enough for now.
Velu's question. I have a feeling Velu doesn't share my optimism right now on on all of this somehow continuing, which also goes back to the question of how I see minorities in Europe in 2060. So does this kind of really difficult to achieve, costly way of building minority democratic agency, is it in the end helpful for minorities when the truth is that titular members of a state can just change things, right? And for all kinds of reasons. So does this in the end help? And to that, I'm saying that, you know, we know, so people live when they live, and and so there are persistent minorities right now. Some of them are shrinking and will continue to shrink. In some cases, there are cultural minorities. They don't necessarily have to be linguistic minorities. I'm thinking Scots, for example, or right, regional minorities. In some cases, there is the possibility to maintain cultural difference. We are talking about cultural difference. So these are people who are maintaining cultural boundaries, and those boundaries can be, you know, the boundary makers vary. Language is one. Actually, the nation state nationalism made language such an important boundary maker. I wrote a book about that. But there are other boundaries as well. There's religious boundary, there's racial, there's all class, whatever. There are all kinds, but the cultural boundaries about how people, you know, live their social life, what rules, how they practice, you know, relationships, marriage, whatever, all of those are cultural things. And I don't think that within the boundaries of territorial political states on the map, there will be cultural homogeneity. I don't think that. I think there will be, bless you, minorities, and there will be persistent minorities. Some of them are there now. Others, you know, there's migration. There's climate migration. There's all kinds of migrations, and time matters. In 2-3 generations, today's diaspora community may start claiming or, you know, organizing for certain things locally, not necessarily. It depends on the state structure, not necessarily in the state center, but locally claiming things. So those are all organized ways of creating, of having decision-making authority over the rules by which you're expected to live. I know that's a mouthful, but that's what agency is. Instead of rules being always made by others for you according to their own interests and norms and cultural codes and expectations. And for those who own a state, there is this sense of titularity. Wherever you are as a titular in a state, you feel it's like air. You feel like this is yours and the other is special, and I have to go out of my way to accept that, to accept that. And so this is an outcome of a structural outcome of a particular kind of organizing power and organizing the way resources are distributed, right? And this is the world we live in now, which doesn't mean that in 2060 is going to be the same. We had high hopes about the European Union in doing more along these ways in the 1990s, early 2000s. I still have hopes for, you know, going, you know, up and down, but going in that direction. So, so I don't know if I answered that, Velo, but I think the thing about ethnic minorities, and I use a quite broad Bourdieuian, I guess, concept of ethnicity as a process of cultural reproduction, which means that ethnic doesn't just mean you know, the kind of biological kinship or so linguistic minorities, cultural minorities, or ethnic, racial minorities, racialized minorities are that have a culture. It's not just assigned otherness because of your skin color, but if there is a cultural aspect of it, like, you know, Black churches, Black institutions in the US, for example, that is a minority culture, or Chinese American, there is a Chinese American culture there are Chinese American local cultures. So those are ethnic too, in this sense. And from that perspective, I think that organized ways of pursuing agency are helping minorities, persistent minorities. There will be persistent minorities of various kinds. So in the end, I think yes. I think yes, it helps minorities to pursue it. Which leads me to your question about how does it apply to other minorities, sexual minorities, for example, or, you know, there's a debate about whether that's a usable category for LGBTQ plus community. Because I'm referring to that a little bit in my introduction to explain why I'm not focusing on sexual minorities. I think some of these categories apply, by the way. And because minority is my main category and I stick to that. I say sexual minorities because community I don't find as helpful. But Velo actually raised this at one point earlier, whether this could apply the minority condition also to sexual minorities and other minorities. And I think in a way, yes, because if there is the mainstream culture is one that considers sexual minorities as special, you know, not part of the mainstream, that's a persistent minority group as well, although usually not territorialized. So the question is whether we can talk about that as a culture in such a layered sense as an ethnocultural minority. And so I think the structural aspect of it is relevant, but in terms of, I'm not sure to what extent it can be used comparatively in the analysis. So I don't know whether I'm doing well enough in answering that question. So I think the structural persistent minority condition is applicable, but I'm not sure these categories are applicable. Thomas. Okay. In institutional. I'm not sure about that. Not sure about that. Not well. Not that. Yeah. Yeah, but it's not as comprehensive, I suppose. Or yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. 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 There are some institutionalized ways of claiming express, like pride. right? Or there are institutions that are known and run and safe places. Anyway, it is a question. It is a good question. Anyway, I'm staying on easier, not that it's easy, it's way too complicated, but I'm focusing on ethnocultural minorities as persistent minorities. Roma, they're included in my category of. And so I'm hoping that in this database, we can also start working on those, because there was also, who asked the question? Csergő, did you ask the question about, yeah. So what happens to smaller minorities? So smaller, but persist. So this is about minority members who are self-described and want to be part of that minority. I'm not talking about those who are not, it's like, I think he's that or she's that because of the name or whatever, but this is about people who are actually choosing or have no other choice, and they're part of a persistent minority. And smaller ones can work well in the inter-minority field. And, you know, coordinate, coalesce with other minorities and be part of a minority cluster, I suppose, that can push for more minority-friendly legislation, institutions, resources, and at the local level. And this happens actually at local levels, which is why it's so important to also look at local governments and municipal level. Actually, that was something else that Tamás suggested that we include, because at first I wasn't paying enough attention. I knew at an abstract level that Migdal said this beautiful thing about state in society, and we know that these are not non-governmental and governmental are not separate from each other in the real world, but that you really actually do have to look at the local level. So there are ways for smaller minorities also to have organized, to work in those fields and cross-border fields, you know, transnational Roma. I'm just saying potentially the cross-border fields. Question about how on earth would anyone want to do that? And that was my big question. So as I started thinking about how am I conceptualizing this minority democratic agency, okay, what does it mean? And so I was realizing that what the primary characteristic was a lot of work. It's very costly. It's very costly because minority people usually are also in charge of the bridging. So it has to be two-directional, but it's usually the minority actors who are telling the non-minority actors that inform them, lobby. It's not, so a lot of the burden is put on the minority actors also in this bridging enterprise. There is literature on, again, on the Canadian cases and also American cases on ignorance on the side of titular members, that it's not necessarily that they don't want minorities to thrive, they just don't care. Because they don't have a stake in it necessarily. Minority members have a stake in it. And usually because of their smaller numbers, and usually smaller numbers of professional educated people, a lot of them were multitask. You're run a civil society organization, you're also a researcher, you may also run for local office. So other people do that too. So none of this is in itself specific to people in the minority condition, but together as a bundle, they create a structural thing from where the state would step in. is what I'm saying in a somewhat simplified way. It's costly. So that's your question is the big question. Why would anyone want to do that? So that's why actually my publisher, an editor at the publisher I'm working with, said to me, it needs extra motivation too, because before that I only had limited agency, extra work, that was it. And she said, motivation. And I said, okay, I'm gonna plug that in.
Maybe with a little bit of time, what I would suggest, I think we, in a way, there are multiple threads in your presentation, we have heard from your presentation, and there are several messages that I can take home with me from this. First of all, we have the condition matter, but then condition has been conditioned, and so the environment matter, the resources matter. What would be the main takeaway I think that you would like to leave this room with? Because I think looking at the gamut of values, efforts to increase the resilience of individual minority groups, also those that you have the project there, and you have data for. We can look beyond and identify individual small groups such as Gaga, many other groups that people might be concerned with, that might inadvertently be used or be perceived as threats to titular groups' security or the titular groups' claim over the ownership of the state and many more. So democratic resilience might not the opportunities in the country face. What would be takeaway message for plural society?
Yeah. Thank you. So it's difficult for me to come up with a one-liner answer to that, but I suppose if the interest is in plural societies, and especially interest in society and social solidarity, resilience in this sense, democracy, then minorities need to be, I think, actively enabled to form associations that make their life, that improve their lives where they live, and provide agency within organizations, and also to make majority members, titular members, aware of the structural condition of the minority condition, that this is a thing. There are reasons why minority people, members, see the state from a different angle, because their experiences are different. And unless they choose to take it off and put on the mainstream culture, it's not necessarily easy. Means you're leaving the family. What? It's not necessarily even possible in some cases for racialized members. Mainstream may not even accept them as easily. So it's not usually, ethnicity is not something that you pick like a buffet table. Most people are kind of born into some situation, and they have familiar attachments and all that. And the minority condition is a structural thing that is a disadvantage. And I think the message here from, when I started looking into this, I realized, this really is, it is a disadvantage. It's a structural disadvantage. And the majority people who happen to be among the mainstream group that owns the state and who have titularity, should think about this, I think, be aware of it. And those among them who like democracy and plural society and inter-ethnic mutuality of respect, I suppose, it's actually good for that if they engage in actively enabling minority people to seek organized ways of agency, political agency, democratic agency. Back to you.
Well, thank you. I think the message is quite quite clear as well. So to all of us studying minorities, but not so much minorities, is that anyone with a commitment to democratic form of government participation should encourage those in a lesser advantageous position not to avail of their opportunities for themselves. It's a little too late. We will. You will have an opportunity to discuss later. Okay? When we are active. But for now, thank you, Zsuzsa, for the encouraging and but yeah, encouraging would be good. Encouraging presentation. We'll be looking forward to the results of the project in the book when it turns out. And
Thank you.
we will continue the conversation after today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.